I mean, we all have our opinions on what we expect from policy support in different sectors and what we expect from uh, budgetary priorities across sectors in terms of the budget outlays and so on. But then, in terms of CBGA's contribution to this discourse, one of the things that CBGA has focused on continuously is to put out in public domain relevant and credible data on public finance, both at the national level and the state level. And this publication also serves that purpose quite well. And we are doing it this time also. We are capturing a lot of relevant data in the publication. And then, in addition to analyzing the implications of those, we have also made a conscious effort. I mean, we have made an effort to explain what goes on behind the scene. Like, it's not that the decisions on different sectors are taken in haste. And there is a lot happening in the domain of public financial management, in the domain of center state sharing of financial responsibility, and a number of other factors. So we have tried to deepen the analysis by giving snapshots of what is happening behind the scene in terms of the policy directions and the equation in terms of center state sharing of financing responsibility and so on. We have also given snapshots of what kind of outputs and outcomes are being envisaged across sectors. So I hope all of you will find the publication useful. But today's program is not about the publication. It is about the discussion with some very eminent panelists. And let me briefly introduce our moderator and the panelists to all of you. So Professor Praveen Jha would be moderating the discussion. He's on the faculty of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. So as all of us know, he's an eminent economist and he has worked extensively and published on a range of sectors and issues. He has also been associated with a number of social movements, providing them guidance on policy issues over the years. And Professor Jha also happens to be one of the co-founders of CBGA and is currently the chairperson of CBGA's Board of Trustees. So we are really glad that Professor Jha continues to take out time for moderating this very important discussion. As panelists, we are really privileged to have with us Professor Amitabh Kundu. Professor Kundu is a very eminent economist who has done seminal work on a range of economic issues, including the issues of migration, urbanization, employment, and inequality. He has authored nearly 25 books and several research papers published in journals in India and abroad. He's also on the editorial board of several national and international journals. Professor Amitabh Kundu taught economics at JNU, and he has nurtured several generations of very bright economists. So currently, Professor Kundu is a senior fellow at World Resources Institute, WRI, and he's also chairing a committee by the Ministry of by the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation, which is monitoring the national survey on the Swachh Bharat mission. We have with us Mr. Arman Ali. He works for the rights of persons with disabilities and is the executive director of NCPEDP, the National Center for Promotion of Employment for Disabled People. I think one of the most prominent organizations working for the rights of disabled people in the country. Arman holds honorary positions in several important committees of the government at national and state levels. He has also received a number of awards for ensuring better education to children with disabilities and as well as for the welfare and development of persons with disabilities. We're very glad to have Arman with us on this panel today. We also are joined by Beena Pallical. Beena is the General Secretary of Dalit Arthik Adhikar Andolan of the NCDHR, National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. Beena has worked extensively on issues of Dalit rights in general and their economic rights in particular. She coordinates the National Coalition for SCP-TSP legislation. She's also the Executive Director of South Asia Dalit Women's Economic Empowerment Program of the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. On this panel, we also have Professor Lekha Chakraborty, an eminent economist who is professor at NIPFP, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. So Professor Lekha Chakraborty is also associated with the Levy Economics Institute of New York. She is well known for her work on macroeconomics and gender, and also for her significant contribution towards institutionalizing gender budgeting in India. She has done substantive work on the macroeconomics of public finance, on fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing of human development, and gender responsive budgeting. And we have with us on the panel Professor R. Ramakumar. He is the NABARD Chair Professor at School of Development Studies in Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He has also been a member of the State Planning Board of Government of Kerala since 2016. Professor Ramkumar has done profound research and published extensively on agrarian issues, rural livelihoods, and issues in development economics. Very recently, he has published an excellent book titled Distress in the Fields, which presents a very comprehensive and authoritative account of Indian agriculture over the last 3 decades. We're really privileged to have very eminent speakers today, and the discussion would be moderated by Professor Jha. In terms of the structure, first, once I request Professor Jha to take over, my colleague Dr. Acharya, Nilachala Acharya, will make a brief presentation, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. And we would be requesting our panelists to speak in 2 rounds. In the first round, they would be requested to take about 8 to 10 minutes each. The second round would be much shorter, of 3 to 4 minutes each. And then we'll try to set aside 25 to 30 minutes for questions and answers and open discussion with all of you. So over to you, Professor Jha. Thank you.
Thank you, Subrat. So as Subrat has already introduced the panelists and the purpose of our getting together, there is very little for me to say, except to start inviting our guests. You would agree that we have indeed a very, very formidable and exciting panel to engage with us. And before we start with our eminent panelists, as Subrat mentioned, let Nilachal present the highlights of CBGA's research in about 12 to 15 minutes. Nilachal, floor is yours.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to present the findings or the analysis of Union Budget that we carried out at CBGA for the year 2023 and 24. And as you know, the title of the publication is Walking the Tightrope. So quickly, I will take all of you through with the analysis or the analytics that we generated and the data points that we have gathered from the Union Budget this year. And obviously, the detailed analysis is available with the publication titled this, and will be available once the meeting is about to over. Okay, so as we all know that the Union Budget 2023-24 presented in a context where we experienced slow economic recovery post the pandemic and persistent unemployment across the sectors and high retail inflation in most of the consumable commodities or primary commodities, and rising inequality in the country with the global economic uncertainties and volatile market and private sector investment. So these are the most important context or the pointers where the Union Budget was presented this year in February. If you look at the overall fiscal space or the total size of the Union Budget, even there has been a visible growth in the center's tax revenue, then the overall size of the Union Budget did not show any increase, and in fact, as a proportion of GDP, it records a decline in the year 2030. I mean, in the coming fiscal. So, as a proportion of GDP, it was below 14% during the 3 financial years pre-pandemic year, and on the onset of COVID-19, as we know that the fiscal space or the total size of the Union Budget went up significantly and reached close to 19%, but on a more or less it has remained 16% during 2021-22. And this sharp increase in the fiscal space, as we all know, because of the onset of the pandemic, most of the outstanding dues were cleared, and there has been a streamline in the accounting processes in terms of bringing the budget items into the budget framework, and also the slowdown in the growth of GDP in those years. And then these numbers are actually, as we can see, that the proportion of the union budget is, in the GDP. So there has been an increase, and the sharp increase has been noticed in the 2021. That was 17.7%, and there has been a decline subsequently, and it has reached at 14.9% in the proposed budget. As a result of this, we can see also how it has impacted on the social sector items. And when we look at the combined share of 15 social sector ministries in the union budget, most of the ministries or the ministries that we look at, agriculture, rural development, was and all. So if we combine all these 15 social sector ministries, the proportion from the union budget has also declined. As we know, this 2021, where the fiscal stimulus was given, and mostly this fiscal stimulus routed through these social sector ministries, and there has been a sharp decline noticed in the current budget, reached at the 21.2%. So in fact, there has been a discussion about the increase in the absolute increase in the union budget to 45 lakh crore compared to what it was in 2002-3, last year's current fiscal revised estimate. So this increase was noticed in two broad items. One is on the capital outlay, capital expenditure, and another item is interest payment. So when we look at the size of the capital expenditure, which is estimated to be around 10 lakh crore, and obviously there has been an increase around 37% compared to the current fiscal revised estimate. And similar, if you look at the interest payment, that is also accounting around 10 lakh crore. So most of these two items, capital expenditure and the interest payment, that accounts 20 lakh crore in the union budget. And when we look at the surge in the tax collection in most recent years, and as we know that this is a strong indicator of the revival of the Indian economy. But the budget for 23-24 has not incorporated the additional fiscal stimulus that would be required through this additional revenue mobilization, as we have seen from the numbers. So the same thing that we can see here, that capital budget is proportional of the total Indian budget, what I was mentioning. But if you look at the right side, or the figures or the data presented in the right side of the graph or the slide, the trends in fiscal deficit since 1920. So here, this is a clear indication of fiscal prudence or consolidation of fiscal path, what the government promised, or achieving the target that they have set for the fiscal deficit. So there has been a decline in the gross fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, and it has been targeted, it has been projected to be 5.9% of the GDP. So this clearly indicates about the clear fiscal consolidation path that the Union government would follow going forward. So as I've already indicated, that there has been an increase in the central tax collection, and these are all visible over last couple of years. And we can see that this increase in the central tax collection are coming from three important items. These are corporation tax, income tax, and customs. And all these noticed 40% growth, whereas and this is expected to grow at 12%, but it was last 3 years. And the buoyancy of tax also had risen sharply to 1.72 in 21-22, but it has dipped to less than 1 in 22-23 and 23-24. So this will have some impact in terms of revenue mobilization, particularly from the tax front. Given the rise in the rate of inflation, there have been demands in terms of reviving the income tax slabs. And the budget 23-24 has proposed changes in income tax slab in order to help basically the middle class or the income tax pay. And this will help to the bracket, those who are in the bracket of around rupees 15 lakh per annum. But these changes in the tax slab has come with a cost to the exchequer, and this tax concession to the middle class income category group, that will have 35,000 crore loss to the exchequer. So these are the points that I was discussing. I was mentioning about that the gross central tax collection and the annual growth rate, there has been an increase over the years. And in terms of central tax collection to GDP ratio, there has been an increase in 21-22, but there is a dip that is noticed in the last two fiscal, and it is projected to be 11% in the coming fiscal. Coming to the nature of the tax kitty at the central level, and there has been a change, and this change is clearly visible with regard to direct and indirect tax provisioning and the collection. So now the direct tax is little succeeding to the indirect tax proportion to the entire tax kitty of the central government. So now around 54% coming from the direct tax and 46% coming from the indirect tax. So there can be, we can attach to some kind of progressivity when we talk about the proportion of increase in the direct tax collection. But the most important thing that we can notice from the Indian budget is with regard to the centralization of the tax revenue and cuts in major subsidy items. When we look at the central divisible, the entire divisible pool, where almost 18% that are coming from the cesses, which excludes, here we have not included the GST collection, GST compensation cess, which is around, they have projected 1.45 lakh. Excluding that, if you look at the entire kitty of the divisible pool, which are not part of the to be set with the states, that is coming around 17%, 18%, and this has been increasing over the years. And looking at the subsidy part, there has been a drastic decline in the subsidies that include food, fertilizer, petroleum. So these subsidy cuts have definitely some negative impact, some significant impact on the social sector items. So there has been a cut in the subsidy in the Indian budget. Coming to the priority for the social sector, as we know that the pandemic had differential impact on this social sector items, social sector issues. However, the fiscal consolidation, as reflected on the reduced size of the fiscal deficit as proportion to GDP, has come at the cost, mostly the stagnated or reduced magnitudes of budgetary outlays for most social sector ministries, which we noticed when we compiled this for 15 important most social sector ministries. That has come down from 33.5% of the Union budget 2021. And obviously, these are the increase that we noticed due to the policy response of the government towards the stimulus, towards the inducement from the public sector investment on most of the food subsidy and rural employment programs. But there has been a decline, which is reached at 21.2% and projected to be 21% for the 23-24 for the coming fiscal. So when we look at item wise within the social sector ministries, the education spending for all the states, for all states in the Union government, when we talk about all states, the respective departments at the state level, those who are catering to the education needs, education sector needs of the states. So there has been a stagnation, over the years, and then there have been, I would say the fluctuation that we can see for all the states that we have compiled, that was for 1 year lag. But this is more or less, it's around 14% of the total state budget. All states budget for education sector coming from the all states total budget. When we talk about union government's responsibility towards the education sector, we have also looked at the numbers, how union government is actually faring in terms of education spending from the ministry, through the Ministry of Education. So the share of the Ministry of Education in the total union budget is now reached at 2.5%. And there has been a stagnation, I would say there's a decline in the ratio in the GDP, 2.37%. Coming to the health sector, the similar kind of trend that we noticed, we observed. So again, from all the states, this is the right side graph of the slide. So the share of health in the total state budget and GDP. So there has been an increase, but now we can see the declining trend also noticed from the state budgets. So this is what the departments which are responsible for catering to the health sector needs from all the states out of the total state budget and the GDP we have computed. So that is coming around close to 1.1%, 2% from the GDP. Whereas if you look at the left side of the graph, where the all health budget is proportional to the GDP and the union budget, this is 0.3% of the GDP and around 2% of the total union budget. Coming to the nutrition intervention, where we talk about mostly the Saksham Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0 and Samartha. And there has been no such visible increase that can be seen from the current year's budget, where the level of food and nutrition insecurity are at the peak. Coming to the waste sector, and obviously this has been a priority area for the government, particularly the drinking water supply program through Jal Jeevan Mission. and mostly the 70,000 crore budget they have projected for the next fiscal, which is an increase over the years. But if you look at the entire budget for the waste sector, there has been no such visible increase. But obviously the Swachh Bharat mission in the phase 2, there has been little priority given in the budgetary allocation in the current budget. And if we look at the economic sector, particularly we looked at the agriculture and allied sector, the rural economy, and the climate action, climate responsive budgeting from the Indian government. What we see that the return of the pre-pandemic growth trajectory of the economy obviously require continued fiscal support from all the quarters and especially from the Union budget. And there has been a decline in allocation of MGNREGs. And for the benefit of all of us, I would like to reiterate here that on 3rd February, there was a release from MORT saying that even that 60,000 crore budget for MGNREGs, that is, this is all about that if there is a need as per the mandate that MGNREGs will get adequate fund from the Ministry of Finance to fund this important program. And there has been an enhanced priority for the rural housing. This is again, it's a very important for creating employment and income support to the rural poor. And with regard to agriculture and allied sector, as we can see, there has been a little increase, and that increase is basically about the individual farmer-centric direct support measures, which is accounting around 73% of the total allocation from the budget. And then allied sector obviously got a boost, but there is a lot more required for the sector to support the economic growth required, the projected economic growth required for the entire economy. And the green growth, obviously, it's one of the most important priority within the 7 Saptarshi that Government of India, the Finance Minister presented in her budget speech. And there has been a clear intention of the government in terms of reducing the carbon intensity across sectors and also provide green job opportunity through adoption of green fuel, green farming, green mobility, etc. And there has been a budget of 35,000 crore set aside basically for capital investment, for clean energy transition funds to state for scrapping polluting vehicles, etc. So there is a clear intention seen from the budget towards producing or towards having a green growth. And budget for agriculture, I'm just giving the numbers so that quickly I'll run through the numbers. So the share of agriculture and allied sector in the budget, there is only 0.5% of the GDP has been spent on or proposed for the agriculture sector in the coming fiscal, and the total size and the size of the agriculture sector from the total budget is around 3% of the Indian budget. When we look at the composition of that particular 3% of the total Indian budget towards agriculture, as we have already discussed that most closely more than 70, 76%, 77% are the direct income support, which actually at the cost probably coming for not having a sector-wide intervention, which would sustain the economic growth for the agriculture sector. And the rural economy, as I've already mentioned about that, rural housing has got a boost in this current budget, and the decline in the allocation for MGNREGs will be supplemented by the Finance Ministry, but the declaration that the circular talked about. Coming to the most, budgetary priorities for the marginalized sections of the population, as we know, in our report also we have a detailed discussed about all these sections of population and what are the impacts of Union budget for women, children, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, religious minority, and persons with disability. So here what we see, budgetary allocation obviously has increased for these groups of population, for this group of communities, but problems mostly related with regard to the policy design, implementation, and underutilization of funds. And obviously these challenges will persist, have been persisting over the years and will continue. So we need to address that. This is what the Government of India's budget talked about. And budget for the children has gone up by 11% from the previous year. Again, the same thing, if you look at and relate with regard to the promises made with regard to this particular children, the benefit of the children, it was recommended 5%, but if you look at the overall budget, what we see, there has been that is not going to meet with this allocation towards the children. On the gender, this is the size of the budget. So you can see the total part A and part B in the budget. Now it has almost stagnated at 2,23,000 crore. So this is how the gender budget statement reports the numbers. On the children, we have discussed about this is only 2.3% of the total budget, which at least the recommended 5% of the budget that would require for the children. On the scheduled caste, you can see the post-matric and pre-matric scholarship, which are direct monetary support to the marginalized students, particularly in this community. So there is no change in the increase. There is no increase, so sharp increase noticed, even though the post-matric scholarship that we have seen some absolute number growth over the time. And Indian budget for persons with disability, this is where the important thing that we can notice. This is a very minuscule budget given to persons with disability, and a lot more probably required for the overall economic development and access and empowerment of the persons with disabilities. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilachala, for giving some of the most important highlights of the broad picture of this budget and setting the context. Thank you very much. Now we go to our panelists. We start with Professor Kundu. Sir, the floor is yours. If you wish to highlight some of the issues pertaining to urban development, employment, and inequality, that, of course, would be very helpful for our participants. But the canvas that you choose is, of course, your choice. Please.
Thank you. I must thank Subrat and Nilachala for this wonderful treat of a presentation. And Praveen, you for making me join this wonderful discussion. Can I make an honest admission, Praveen? This is the first time that I'm joining actively in the CBGA budget discussion. Every time I plan to join, I get nervous that I know at the end of the detailed presentation, by the time the issues, trends, and the patterns and the areas of concern settle down in my mind, and I have some clarificatory questions, the session will be over. So I always use the CBGA document on my desktop and read it with a pen and pencil, and I have never been able to join and have the courage to join in the panel discussion as I do today. But, I was really impressed by the depth of the analysis and the way the facts have come out. And it looks very dispassionate, although one can see clearly an analytical framework behind it. And I'm quite confident that people with different ideological perceptions, irrespective of that, would be finding it extremely important among the researchers, among the policymakers, administrators, and also the political leaders. I must congratulate CBGA for this wonderful job they're doing year after year. Now, I thought, I'll just flag one or two issues instead of going into the detailed, discussion on the various subjects. But the two things that Praveen, you also mentioned, which have not exactly figured in the discussion, but it is part of the budget. I'll just touch upon that and then wait for others in the panel to comment on the areas of concern that have been identified. Praveen, I must tell you that my reading of Karl Marx and Lenin, and also of Adam Smith and Marshall and Keynes, and lately Danny Rodriguez, who talks about premature deindustrialization, about the functioning of capitalism in India. My understanding is certainly very, very inadequate. I have learned a bit from Prabhat, from Chandru, Jayati, and you. My understanding, if I can put in a very simple terms, the capitalist system, the way it functions here, is that it allows an individual to acquire endowments, capabilities on the basis of the limited resources that person has and the intelligence or the genetic capabilities, take those capabilities into the market and earn certain income level. And besides that, earning from the capabilities, a person under capitalist system is allowed to generate income through capital that the person has inherited or the asset that the person has inherited. There is absolutely nothing criminal against a person who earns 2 lakhs as a salary and 20 crore as a part of the investment that he has made on the basis of the capital that the person has inherited. There is nothing wrong. And this perspective, despite our talk on socialistic pattern of society, has not changed. It has not changed with the constitutional amendment that we had in 74 or the political regime change in 1998, 1999, 2004, and 2014. This perspective that we are basically in a capitalist system, despite budgets making 1 or 2 small changes, that has remained constant. Now, why I'm mentioning it, that in 2014, the government made a major declaration, 2 major declarations in the joint session, which was Prime Minister's Awas Yojana. Everybody will have housing as a matter of right. Now, when I talk to people in the finance department, my friend D. Rakesh Mohan, he says, in India, food is also not a human right. Food is a commodity. How can you have housing as a matter of human right? But nonetheless, this statement was made, everybody will have a house, particularly 78% of the housing will be for the slum dwellers and the poor. That was the announcement made. The second major announcement was a pension scheme for the unorganized worker in the rural and urban areas. I just want to talk about these 2 in the context of the budgetary announcement that have been made. The pension scheme was in 2015, Nirmala Sitharaman brought it out as Atal Pension Yojana. Next year, it was modified into Prime Minister's Shram Yogi Mandhan. I just want to talk about these 2 and what are the implications in the context of the present budget. The Atal Pension Yojana requires a person joining the scheme at the age of 18 years. Please listen to this carefully. At the age of 18 years, the person has to join, and if the person joins, 126 rupees per month, you make a contribution, and at the age of 60 years, you stop contributing that, and that amount that you have deposited, 126 per month, would add up to something like 70,000-80,000 rupees. Assuming government will give a rate of return of 8%, this amount will become 3 lakhs, roughly 3 lakhs. That's the calculation that we have made on the Atal Pension Yojana. So the poor person in the unorganized sector saves 3 lakhs. Of course, that has government's contribution 50%, but that was discontinued after a year. But the total amount that comes to his hand is about 3 lakhs, which can be taken as a lump sum, or it can be converted into a pension of 3,000 rupees per month, 1,500 for the wives, family pension. But once both of them die, the amount can be given to a nominee. That was the scheme. Nirmala Sitharaman modified it next year, saying, no, the amount 126 is too high. This has to be brought down. It was brought down to 55 rupees. And the amount, the rate of interest, which was given was 3%. He said, no, 8% rate of interest would be given now, but there'll be, no contribution. If you take contribution of the government, 50%, you withdraw that, it actually comes to 8% rate of return. And that is what currently existing. I was hoping that this 8% rate of return, which entitles the person to get 3,000 rupees, and on death of the beneficiary and the spouse, the amount goes to the government. It doesn't come to the nominee. The person dies at the age of 62 after retirement. Only 2 years the person benefits, but if the person survives for 100 years, then he will get 3,000 rupees. But nonetheless, the amount, there's no corpus fund which is given under Prime Minister's Shram Mandhan Yojana. I'm just mentioning, I know that I'm exhausting my time limit. I'm mentioning it because for the organized sector, for people like me, I have health insurance, I have a pension amount, and I have the provision of putting 15 lakhs of rupees, which gives me an additional, pension amount, and there is a subsidy, subsidy being provided by the government in interest, which comes to 3,000-4,000 rupees per month to me. And that amount of 15 lakhs has been increased to 30 lakhs. For the the post offices, 4 lakhs was the amount that could be deposited. This has also increased to 9 lakhs, and there is a significant interest subsidy for the middle class. I'm not going into the income tax structure, which gives a massive, subsidy for the middle class. And I looked at the CBGA report. It talks about 35,000 crore, which is the amount which will come down because of the income tax, subsidies which is being given, concessions that are being given. Now, this implication of increasing 15 lakhs exemption to 30 lakhs and 4 lakhs to 9 lakhs is something which needs to be examined. Why I am mentioning, if the poor persons who is now into the Shram Mandhan Yojana puts in 3 lakhs, that's the whole lifetime earning, is entitled only on 3 lakhs, 8.5% rate of return. Whereas a person in the organized sector who can easily put 30 lakhs gets that concessional amount on 30 lakhs, not on 3 lakhs. I was wondering, why can't this, you can put your crores of inherited money and earn whatever you want. But if the government is talking about addressing the social concern, pension amount till lifetime, then the amount should be the same. Give the same amount of subsidy which you are giving to the rich on 30 lakhs, you give the same amount of subsidy on 3 lakhs, so that if you give a rate of return, it has to be at least 15-20%, so that by putting 555 rupees, the person can get a 5,000 rupees rate, pension amount. Similarly, I could have talked about the housing. The housing plan was meant for the poor, and you find the way it has been structured, the concessions that have been get on tax exemption, these are all targeted to the middle class. I just don't want to get into that. But nonetheless, the critical issue is that what the government is flagging to do is that we are addressing the pension scheme for the unorganized sector and for the housing for the slum dwellers. That certainly is not reflected in the budgetary allocations and the provision. Sorry, Praveen, I took a little more time.
Not at all, sir. These were very, very perceptive and useful remarks. And hopefully we have a little more discussion amongst all of us on these very, very important issues. And in any case, in the next round, you can pick up some other issues. So thank you very much, sir. Okay, so we now move to Mr. Arman Ali. Arman, if you could, as I suggested in case of Professor Kundu, please feel free to discuss anything that you want to focus on. But if you could talk a little bit about rights pertaining to persons with disabilities, that would be very useful. Thank you, Arman. Please go ahead. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, Subrat, for having me here. I think I must admit that I'm a great admirer of the work that CBGA done. And me and my colleague at NCPEDP, we look up to the support which Subrat and his team gives us, and it's always a learning experience interacting with you all. And thank you for having me here today in this August, amongst such senior luminaries of the sector and understanding. Well, I'm a kind of a layman when it comes to numbers and finance, but I do understand that people with disability are people first and then the disability. And I could not agree more with Nilachala when he says that people with disabilities were the hardest hit during the pandemic. And one of the things that has happened is that the people with disability, the sector has lost a seat on the table. Over the last 2 decades of struggle of disability rights, disability sector were able to negotiate some of their rights pertaining to education, employment, accessibility, and so on. But with the pandemic, which hit us so hard that we have lost that ability to do so, and we are back to the system where the discourse has moved to a pension. And just for the knowledge of everybody here, the pension which is given now to persons with disability in India, which varies from rupees 200 per month to 2,500 rupees in some state, and it doesn't cover all people with disabilities. It's limited to a certain number of people who have the disability identity card, and more so, which is called UDID card, which only about 15 to 20% of people have, and the rest still struggle to find ways to do it. In the strong backdrop of talks around this resurging and speedily growing Indian economy, the disabled people, we were looking up to the budget of 2023, and the aspiration was not much to be just part of the mainstream society, to be able to be part of the education. The national education policy talks of inclusion of persons with disability right from early childhood development to higher education, but it's very disheartening to see that we did not find mention of disability when it comes to education, employment, accessibility, health coverage, housing or transport, and so on. And the needs of disabled people are no different, and also I would like to put it on record that people with disability in India, they don't have right to access to insurance. I don't have insurance coverage, health insurance, and many people with disability don't have it. And even the Ayushman Bharat insurance doesn't specifically talk about including people with disability under the universal health coverage and so on. These were one of our top asks to the government, to have a universal health coverage for persons with disabilities, under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, the income eligibility to be changed to 1 lakh rupees per annum, and not just a below poverty line certificate and so on. The total allocation of the budget this year, what I learned, is around 0.227%, and it just talks about allocation to the Department of Empowerment of Persons with Disabilities. Now, this department is in charge of giving these schemes like ADIP. Through ADIP, you can get aids and appliances for mobility and other purpose. And DDRS, that is the Deen Dayal Upadhyay Rehabilitation Scheme for organizations running special schools and so on. But this does not provide any budget to the other ministry. There's the law, the Rights of Persons with Disability Act talks about 5% allocations in all schemes for persons with disability, especially in poverty alleviation schemes and so on. So it completely misses out when it comes to persons with disability, which is very disheartening. There's no discussion of, in the recent past, the BSEL company, which is floated a tender of 5,000 EV buses to be procured. They completely flouted the standards which is needed to make it accessible for people with disability. And as we talk that the 66% of the total population of India is under 35 years of age. If you look at disability at 3%, I think we talk about 2.5 CR people with disabilities. And if you look at the World Health Organization, which says 15% of the world population are persons with disabilities, this would be an whopping number, I think, and it will cross more than 10 crore or 12 crore people. So this community, the persons with disability, requires investment. And with this budget completely looked away from people with disability. It was interesting to see when the finance minister started the budget and talked about 7 priorities. The first priority did mention persons with disability, Divyangjan, and so on. But there is no investment, or there is no schemes which is designed for persons with disability to make India accessible for persons with disabilities. We live in a country which is highly inaccessible, and that's the reason why when we go out to schools, colleges, market, cinema, banks, restaurant, you don't see persons with disability. So in a very highly inaccessible country, which has the strongest legislation on disability, which talks about making all infrastructure in the country within 5 years of enacting this act. And we have crossed that timeline on 17th of June 2022. So where should have been the investment? Where should the budget has been put in creating more accessible products, service, infrastructure, transport system for persons with disability, which we completely failed to see. And direct benefit transfers are also important. I don't negate that point. Some of the, but it has to be in line about some research, some study to understand what is the cost of disability, what is the cost of living with a disability in India for an every day for a person to travel from their home to school, to college, to market, to the place of work. It's not easy. And when you don't have a coverage of insurance, you don't have coverage of allowances, which can take care of our other needs. So I think it completely looked away from the rights perspective. It is in conflict with the own legislation of Rights of Persons with Disability Act, which is so progressive and talks about equality and brings accountability for all sectors, including the private, when it comes to accessibility for persons with disability. But I think it has completely looked away, and persons with disability continue to remain an afterthought. And the struggle of persons with disability to survive in this country will continue. Thank you so much, Subrat and the team, for giving me this opportunity. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Arman, for stressing these extremely important points. We need to, of course, focus a lot more on these issues. We now move to Ms. Beena Pallical. Beena, floor is yours. Again, same request or suggestion that pick up whatever you want to focus on. But if you could also highlight issues of Dalits, Adivasis, minorities, and children, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Really nice to be here. Thanks to Subrat and team for inviting me on this panel. On endorsing a lot of what is said here by the last two speakers, and also thanks for the presentation by CBGA that was really great. A lot is said about in her speech about Amrit Kal, and I actually didn't even know what that meant. I had to Google it to see what it meant, what it exactly meant. And I was just wondering who this Amrit Kal is for. Who are the people who are going to benefit the most? Is it the most marginalized groups? Is it the middle class? Is it the most, or are we also going, is this budget going to create more Adanis and Ambanis? And I think, as usual, a lot of fanfare about this budget, but we can see a trend over the last few budgets that slowly schemes for the most marginalized, whether it be the Dalits, Adivasis, or even the minority Muslim community, slowly these schemes are being almost pulled under the carpet, either in the garb of renaming it, which is almost trying to fool us, or completely, like they've removed the Maulana Azad scholarship. The pre-matric scholarship is already almost removed. I think just a very minuscule amount of 500 crores this year, but I'm thinking the next budget, even that will not be here, because they've already announced that the right to education is going to take care of that. So we are removing the pre-matric. I'm not so sure about it. So there's a lot being said about, schemes that are, and I feel that this year it's almost like renaming ceremony, Naam Karan, they say, where, these schemes are just taken, renamed, if there's a saying, what's in a name, but I think there's a lot in a name in this budget. And somehow I feel that by doing this, changing these names and putting them under different budget heads, it's also difficult for us to track those numbers and whether those numbers are actually what we are looking for. Is that the allocation that we want? It's also difficult to track. So some schemes are clubbed together. So in a way, sort of almost like a play with us, with those numbers that they. But of course, looking at those numbers say a lot of where the priority of the government lies. Uh, as we all know that the allocation for the scheduled castes is about 1,59,000. That's about 11%. So 4% short of, sorry, 5% short of what they're supposed to give. For Dalits, it should be 16.6%, and for Adivasis, it should be 8%. Adivasis, they have given almost proportionate allocation, which is about 1,19,000. It's welcome. However, if we unpack those numbers, we really can see where that money is going, and I'll come to that in a bit. The second point I'd like to say that these numbers look really good on paper, 1,59,000, 1,20,000. But actually, if you break it down and if you see where this money is exactly going to, and what we have analyzed is a lot of this money is going to schemes that have no relevance to the community. That will not be an Amrit Kal for the Dalit or Adivasi community. It is going to schemes that are absolutely, I will come to those schemes where this money is going. But at the end, if you actually look at the amount that is going to the Dalits and Adivasis, like for specific schemes like the Post-Matric Scholarship or employment, etc., it is only about the targeted scheme for Dalits is only about 30,475 schemes. That is only about that is the amount of 1,59,000. So just look at it. 1,59,000 crores is allocated. Out of that, only 30,000 crores is actually going to schemes that are benefiting the community. The rest of the scheme, the rest of the money is all going to schemes that have no relevance or are being diverted to other schemes. Whereas for Adivasis, it's 1,19,000 crores, which is actually allocated. Out of that, only 24,000 crores is actually going to, to the community. Nilachala in his presentation already spoke about post-matric scholarship. It is welcome that there has been an increase in these scholarships for, which is one of the most critical schemes. 66 lakh students avail of this post-matric scholarship. So it's a critical scheme for development of the community. And there they have given an increase. However, the demand of the community is to increase that to 10,000 crores. And we hope that that will be done in the next budget. The other thing that we're seeing is we'll go to the schemes where actually I'm going to give a list of where this money is going, that where the money should go and where the money is going. For example, there's excess allocation in notional schemes, so schemes that have no relevance. We are saying that 15,400 crores of the Jal Jeevan Mission is being allocated from the SDP budget. Now, it's okay, water, sanitation, we need, but there is no specific guidelines or there is no disaggregated data to show where this money is going. And is it actually going to provide for the members of this community? So if those guidelines say otherwise, then it is not a specific targeted scheme, but it's a scheme that they're just putting in as a general budget. Second, urea subsidy. Now, urea subsidy of 14,862 crores is being allocated. 14,000, that's a huge amount, is allocated to the SD budget. But even if you look at that, many are landless laborers. So putting that much of a high amount in this is very clear that it is actually going to the as a general scheme. Now, if you look at the ST, they gave a proportionate allocation. Out of that, 23,375 of the Adivasi budget is going to road work, to build roads. We have been screaming hoarse for so many years now to say that we cannot put infrastructure budget in this, specifically if they're general roads and highways. This has been brought, this was debated in Parliament as well in 2010 regarding the stadium. So somewhere they're continuing to do this, and this is a gross violation of the guidelines of SCP. And similarly, there is also urea subsidy of 7,000 crores in the ST budget as well, where there are very good schemes, where there are very less allocation. There's a national overseas scholarship. We all know that many students go abroad to study to get, get admission in foreign universities. There's only about 50 crore allocation for the SC, and for the STs, it's about 4 crore. How many students can, sorry, 40 crore. How many students can get admission in this? It's a very less amount. So this we are trying to say that, you have to increase some of these schemes. Venture capital fund. We know that we need venture capital or capital fund for, starting our own companies, etc. is about 70 crore. And this includes both SCs as well as OBCs. They've clubbed it in one scheme. I wonder why they did that, but it's the same for venture capital fund for scheduled tribes. It's about 30 crore. So there are schemes. I can go on. There are a list, but I'm not going to go. I just gave some of these examples to show that how the schemes that are supposed to have a good allocation is not having good allocation, whereas schemes that are, does not have any impact are given more money. And one last point, Professor, and then I'll stop, is that as we know, the NCRB data, the violence against Dalits have increased. In the last 2021 NCRB, it was about 50,000 crimes. Out of that, about 8,000 crimes only on women. They have allocated a mere 150 crore for the violence against women. And so it's showing where their priority is, that while this violence is increasing, there is no money put in to ensure or prevent these kind of violence that is happening. Like this, all the schemes have, where there are powerful schemes and are useful for the community are starved of funds, whereas the general schemes are given more funds. So I think this is something that we have to take up, both the CBGA, us and other members who are working on budgets to ensure that these demands can be taken to the ministry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beena, for stressing again these extremely, extremely important issues. These have, as you rightly noted, persisted almost since the inception of what was supposed to be trying to correct for a huge history of wrongdoings, discrimination, etc. But unfortunately, in spite of some 4 decades or so, very little progress has been made. So, Beena, you have raised extremely important points. And as you rightly said, that CBGA and everyone needs to become part of that process of challenging these extremely undesirable kinds of directions. Thank you very much. Now we come to Professor Lekha Chakraborty. As Subrat mentioned, that she has done a lot of work in macroeconomic policy discourses, focusing on empowerment of women, gender issues, green economies, etc. So if you wish, Lekha, please go ahead with the foregrounding these in your 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Subrat, for having me. It's the first time I'm here with you for the budget panel, and special thanks to your team and Nilachala for this wonderful backdrop he has done on the budget. My presentation, I will be focusing on the macro things. First of all, the government projected this budget as a beyond GDP budget with focusing on, many categories of people, including women. Intersectionality issues were highlighted. But the question here is, where is the money allocated? As the panelists before me asked, whether these announcements and this focus of beyond GDP paradigm, whether that is supported by adequate resources. So that's a question number one. Now, what is the punch of the budget? The budget, Nirmala Sitharaman has not deviated from her fiscal consolidation path. She has announced that by 25-26, the fiscal deficit needs to be brought down to 4.5% of GDP. And this year she pegged it on 5.9. So she has not deviated from the fiscal consolidation path. Now, the fiscal consolidation need to be less painful. So we need to focus on the revenue buoyancy. And this is a time of revenue uncertainties. So what is that avenues in which the fiscal space is going to be improved? So the articulation related to that improving fiscal space, that was quite absent in the budget. Unlike earlier years, this year, there was no announcement related to the realistic targets related to disinvestment or any avenues in which the fiscal space is protected. So over the years, what has happened is there was an issue of budget credibility, the tax projections and the tax realized. There was a huge deviation between the two. And if you look at the numbers, the magnitude of that deviation as a percentage of GDP, it is around 1%. So if such kind of deviation happened and there are issues related to budget credibility, that eats into the degrees of freedom when you plan or when you design your expenditure, because revenue stability is very important for the expenditure design. So that spill over to the size of the government. Over the years, the size of the government was shrinking. So this is the macro picture in which the focus was given on the capex spending. The narrative was that if you increase the capex, that will crowd in the private corporate investment, and in turn, the economic recovery will be ensured. But we can see that the capex as a percentage of GDP over the years remaining stagnant. And one good acknowledgement that has happened in this budget and the earlier budget is that it is not a top down when we think about the capex. We need to take the principle of subsidiarity and the state governments on board when we plan the capex. So there was like 1 lakh crore and 1.2 lakh crore transfers were given to the subnational government. So that is welcome, because the states are going to do the heavy lifting in terms of the capex. Now, the fiscal consolidation has to be less painful when we say that we need to understand the disappearing deficits. That also have macroeconomic consequence. It's like the narrative so far is the fiscal deficit has macroeconomic consequence. No, disappearing deficit has got more macroeconomic consequences, and especially the revenue deficit. If you phase it out, then if it is through the revenue expenditure compression, then you're going to have it. And if you look at the subsidies, food, fertilizer, petroleum subsidies, of course, when I compare to the RE of the 2022-23 and this BE 23-24 BE, of course there is a bloodbath. There's a heavy reduction in the subsidies, but the rationalization of subsidies, when you look into by comparing with BE and BE, like the BE of 2022 and 2023 FY, if you compare, then of course that's a way they argued that the slash is not that harsh, and the subsidies are on the rise if you look into BE and BE. So how you pitch it, whether you want to see the RE and BE comparison or to BE comparison, that's is important. But one nice thing that has happened is the ensuring food security over the next 1 year. That's welcome, because inflation hurts poor. And over the years, we thought that with the new monetary policy framework, the inflation containment can happen through the monetary policy stance. And we failed in doing that. Over more than 3 consecutive quarters, inflation is above the comfort zone. And RBI has now given the report that why they were not able to control the inflation within the inflation targeting that mandate or the nominal inflation anchor. So if that is the case, there is a fundamental rethinking that needs to happen related to who is responsible for inflation containment. And if we think that if it is RBI, not the fiscal policy makers, then we are doing on the side of the caution. Why? Because inflation has supply shocks. It is because of the supply side shocks that inflation is happening. So monitoring or changing the repo rate, we are unable to control the inflation. So fiscal policy makers, they have a major role to play over controlling inflation. And sad to say that in the budget, the inflation hurts poor, that acknowledgement, and the fiscal measures to control that inflation, the mounting inflation, that was quite absent. And it's a matter of concern, that I have to flag. And another, food security, of course, now within the cooperative federalism, the food security measures were ensured by the subnational governments. But in this budget, they announced that at the national government, it's going to ensure the food security over next 1 year. And now coming to the questions related to the gender budgeting and the climate financing budgeting, because these two are very important PFM tools we need to look into when we talk about the budget management, because economic stimulus packages were short-run in nature. After a point of time, it was rolled back, and we have done it premature normalization procedure and earlier than expected hikes in the interest rates. So in such situation, excuse me, PFM tools, the long-term PFM tools like gender budgeting, child budgeting, and the climate financing, budgeting or the climate responsive budgeting, these are very relevant to look into. And what happened to the gender budgeting? It's a very promising framework, but we have seen that the allocation stagnated over the years, and there's a fundamental rethinking that's very much required related to this promising framework, that why this is happening, why it is stagnant. So if it is stagnant over the years, should we be moving towards an ex-ante gender budgeting than ex-post gender budgeting? So that's a question we need to look into right now. And if you look into the first gender budget statement, regarding the public incidence benefit incidence analysis, I think Pradipha has done marvelous works on public benefit incidence analysis, public expenditure benefit incidence analysis in terms of the education sector. So we need to look into those methodologies and the importance of those methodologies when we talk about these long-term public financial management tools like gender budgeting. Because in the first gender budgeting statement, it was there, but over the years, we have just confined to the part A and part B. And now it's a time that if it is stagnating, what could be the innovative ways in which we can, revamp the gender budgeting statement by looking into the ex-ante gender budgeting and use it as a tool for the social justice. But again, the question is related to the fiscal fiat and the legal fiat. And if it is legally mandated, things can happen quickly. And the legally mandated fiscal rules we can see only for the FRBM. So if I am arguing for a legally mandated, climate responsive budgeting or gender budgeting, I'm not talking about public interest litigation, because in the case of the employer of last resort policies, we mandated it as public interest litigation. It's a wonderful program by the government to ensure, to guarantee jobs to the people. If it is not done, it's the public interest litigation, and we can take the case up. So gender budgeting, climate responsive budgeting, these were not looked into from the perspective of public interest litigation. But if that has to happen, it has to be owned by the women, across, regions. If they consider that we have a wonderful tool, gender budgeting, that's our say to the government, and our preferences, revealed preferences can be incorporated in the budget through gender budgeting. So that kind of an awareness happens within the household. When the gender budgeting, that tool will become a tool within the household, household, then only these kind of revolutions will happen. Otherwise, it needs to be legally mandated. Then final point on the climate. Of course, India has entered into the first adaptation communication. And in that steering committee, I worked closely with the government. So against the COP27 in the Egypt. So we have prepared, NIPFP has prepared the first national adaptation communication, the public expenditure requirements for the government. But what is absent is these PFM tools are treated in isolation, in watertight compartments. Like gender budgeting is not a part of climate responsive budgeting. So when we prepare the climate responsive budgeting, an adequate lens of the gender and the intersectionality issues, these were not adequately included. Otherwise, we think about earmarking, just like the way it happened globally, that cashing in on oil or the Black economic empowerment. We have, something below the state, called the District Mineral Fund, in which an earmarking of the proceeds, the fiscal proceeds for the spatial inequality issues, or it can also be related to the human development issues. Otherwise, overall, if you look into, there was an attempt by the government to pitch it as a beyond GDP budget. But when you look into the numbers, whether it is adequately substantiated, that's a matter of concern. So high deficit and high debt is welcome. That is quite substantiated through increase in the capex, not through the human capital formation or addressing the intersectionality issues, which requires immediate attention. I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lekha, for these, again, very, very important points. And I hope that we'll have some discussion on these issues. So for now, let's move to our last panelist for the first round, Professor Ramkumar. Ram, if you could also focus on issues of sharing of resources between the union government and states. Of course, the core area that you like to talk about happens to be agriculture and allied sectors, rural development, rural economy. So floor is yours, Ram. Please go ahead. Most welcome.
Thank you, Praveen, and thank you to CBGA for having invited me for this presentation. I also congratulate the CBGA for the rather excellent overview of the numbers involved in the budget, which was presented in the beginning. I congratulate Subrat, Nilachala, and others for having brought out that so quickly and so ably. So a lot of what many of us probably wanted to say are probably covered there, and so we have some time to focus on other matters. But I'll just make two quick comments on the broad numbers in the budget as I see it, because they help me lead into my major points related to the sectoral emphasis. The first is the whole overall budgetary fiscal stance is very clear. And that is that the fiscal deficit, we can quarrel about whether it is right or wrong, but the fiscal deficit is assumed to is scheduled to fall from 6.4% in the ongoing year to about 5.9% in the next year, which is about 0.5% of the GDP less in the next year. Now, if you look at what is happening to other numbers in the budget, if I look at, for example, the gross tax revenue in the budget, which is on the receipt side, you will see that there is a lot of claims in the media that our tax revenues are going up, tax buoyancy is up, and so on. But if I just take the GDP as the benchmark and see what is happening to different tax revenue numbers, you will see that the gross tax revenue is going to stay exactly at the same place next year as it is today. It was 11.1% this year. It is going to be 11.1% next year as well. So there is no change in gross tax revenues vis-a-vis the size of the GDP. If you take non-tax revenues also, and that's probably because there is no disinvestment coming up next year, in terms of non-tax revenues also, they are going to stay exactly at 1% this year and in the next year. So neither gross tax revenue nor the non-tax revenue is going to rise, and your fiscal deficit is going to fall from 6.4% to 5.9%. The only conclusion you can draw from this, as any basic arithmetics would tell you, is that expenditures will fall. So it's very simple. It must fall. Otherwise, the budget can't remain a budget. So a lot of people claiming that this is an expansionary budget and all in the media simply don't understand the number. It's a contractionary budget. Whether you agree with fiscal deficit falling or not is a different matter. But it's a contractionary budget if you take as a share of the GDP. Now, if this is the, if you take the total expenditure, your numbers very clearly showed your total expenditure to GDP ratio will fall from 15.3% to 14.8%, if I'm getting the decimals right. That's exactly the same percentage by which fiscal deficit is going to fall. Your total expenditure will fall at exactly the same rate. So there isn't much to worry about there, but the numbers are very clear. Now, what is happening as a result? As a result, what is happening is expenditures have to be cut somewhere. And the large share of that cut has now fallen on revenue expenditures in this budget. And that's the key point that we must emphasize on. Revenue expenditures as a share of GDP is going to fall from 12.6% of the GDP to somewhere close to 11.5% of the GDP. That's going to be the broad fall. It's a huge fall, by the way. 12.6 to 11.5 is about 1.1% of the GDP. That's going to be the fall of revenue expenditure. And where is that fall of revenue expenditure going to take place in? It is going to take place in it is very visible in the cut in food subsidy. That is about 2.9 lakh crores to about 1.9 lakh crore. Fertilizer subsidy from 2.3 lakh crore to 1.7 lakh crore. Petroleum subsidy from 9,170 crores to 2,257 crores. The fall of PM Kisan allocation from 68,000 crore to 60,000 crore. The fall in NREGS allocation from 89,000 crore to 60,000 crore. All these are examples of cuts in revenue expenditure, which very clearly are adding up to this fall of 12.6% to 11.5% in terms of revenue expenditure to GDP ratio. So that side is very clear. government is also claiming that capital expenditures are going to rise from 7.5 lakh crores to about 10 lakh crores. Effectively, it will probably, it's going to rise further. But even there, a lot of close observers of the budget have raised a number of questions. I see, I read Professor Ratin Roy making this point that if you actually add up the total capital expenditure of the central government and the central PSUs, they are going to stay exactly at 3.9% of percentage of the GDP, irrespective of this rise in capital expenditure of the central government by 2.5 lakh crore, because exactly the similar amount is has fallen on the side of capital outlay for public sector units of the center. So if you add up the two, there is absolutely no change going to take place in the extent of capital expenditure in the next year. Second is that a part of this has been given to state governments. 1.3 lakh crore has been allotted to state governments for borrowing for capital expenditure. I don't understand why this is the case. If you really want to, because states are not quite interested in this loan for multiple reasons. Article 293.3 of the Constitution essentially says, and this is what states like Tamil Nadu are extremely worried about, if you take a loan from the center like this, for 50 years duration, then it basically ties you to the central government for 50 years, because you cannot take any other loan without an explicit approval from the central government till you have repaid the loan to the central government. That's Article 293.3 of the Constitution. And many states are deeply worried that this will adversely affect their autonomy vis-a-vis the center, and hence they are not opting for this loan at all. Much better option here would have been to actually increase the borrowing limit of the state governments and tell them that you have to use this for capital expenditure. That would have been a much more easier and a much more democratic form of raising the capital expenditure of states. But by doing this way, by making it the capital expenditure of the center and making it a loan to the states, it's going to be disincentivizing for the states to take up this money and spend for capital expenditure. So I do not think that this money is going to be taken up by the states. The experience of the current year, where there is about 1 lakh crore allocated to a very similar scheme, shows that the total capital expenditure of the states between April and November appears to have risen only by about 7% and not more. That's a number that I saw in the Financial Express. This essentially shows that the states are not interested in this. So it's highly unlikely that this increase in capital expenditure is likely to be realized in the next year, though the center claims of this huge capital expenditure increase in the budget. That's one. The second part, second broad point that I wanted to make here is about states. Now, there's a lot of talk about the poor financial situation of the states vis-a-vis of the center. And a simple perusal of the fiscal deficit numbers will tell you that this is completely wrong. The center's fiscal deficit is 5.9% of the GDP, whereas the state's combined fiscal deficit is only 3.5% of the GDP. Whose financial condition is worse and whose financial condition is better? States are actually allowed to take only 3% of borrow. Untied of the 3.5 is only 3. 0.5% is tied to power sector reforms. Okay, if you don't do power sector reforms, you don't get that 0.5%. You're at 3%, and that's most likely to be the case that the next year's fiscal deficit of all states combined will be somewhere between 3 and 3.5, because many states will not use the 0.5. So essentially, you're going to see 5.9 for the center and somewhere between, let's say, 3.3 or something for all states together, which will show the center in an extremely bad light in terms of fiscal health than states. So all this shouting at states saying that their financial condition is bad and the centers is so much better is complete nonsense. That's completely not borne by any numbers of the fiscal deficit that we have. Now, let me come to the area in which I work more in, and I look more at agriculture. In agriculture, if you see, if I were the finance minister, I'm happy I'm not, but if I were before the budget, I would be really worried about 2 or 3 things. I would be really worried about 1 or 2 global features of what is happening around us. One is there is a global food crisis looming large. Now, you can say that a lot of India's food production is adequate for our feeding requirements, but still food inflation is growing everywhere. And in India as well, there is a rise in food inflation, though there is a bit of softening up in the recent years. So I would be really worried about about cushioning the Indian population from the rise of food inflation that is likely to take place over the next year, or food inflation that is likely to remain high over the next year, even if not rise. Second is, there is a global fertilizer crisis that is looming large. Over the last 2 years, fertilizer prices have risen by 200% at the global level. If you look at India itself, a large number of fertilizer prices have risen very sharply. If you actually look at 1919 NPK fertilizer, it cost only 1,900 rupees per bag 2 years back. Today, it costs 3,800 rupees per bag. Right? If you take fertilizer like muriate of potash, it used to cost only 875 rupees per bag 2 years back. Today, it is costing 1,700 rupees per bag. Sulfate of potash was 1,800 rupees per bag. It is today 4,800 rupees per bag. Right? And regardless of all the talk of fertilizer prices softening up, you have a doubling or tripling of fertilizer prices over the last 2 years, and you have to shield the Indian farmer from that looming crisis of profitability, increase in cost of cultivation, etc. But as I said earlier, your fertilizer subsidies have fallen from 2.3 lakh crore to 1.7 lakh crore. And that essentially will show that your fertilizer prices are likely to remain high. And what you're trying to do is you're going to, you have chosen all kinds of pseudo-scientific means of plugging that fertilizer subsidy. What are you trying to do? You have a scheme called PM Pranam. What is the scheme about? This scheme is about, there is a total urea subsidy given from the center to states. Now, states are told that if you actually incentivize your farmers to put less urea, and you actually claim less urea subsidy from the center next year, suppose a state is getting 100 rupees, and the state is actually claiming only 50 rupees as fertilizer subsidy for urea next year, 50 rupees you have saved, and of that 50 rupees, 50% of that 50 rupees, which is 25 rupees, will be given to the state as a grant under PM Pranam for producing alternative fertilizers. It's a complicated scheme. And it essentially incentivizes the states to tell its farmers not to put more fertilizers because it helps the central government to save upon its fertilizer subsidy. As a result, PM Pranam has no budgetary head of account. PM Pranam is supposed to be financed from the savings of the fertilizer subsidy. That's the financial source or the source of funds for this particular scheme. Then you have something called the Natural Farming Mission, which gets about 500 crore. Instead of giving it to ICAR or agricultural university system in this country, which will help build a knowledge economy in this country, you are giving money to incentivize subsidies for cow dung, cow urine, etc. The politics of this policy is not clear to many people on the progressive side as well, because they are blind fans of natural farming, and there appears to be no scientific validation for this concept. Productivity levels are going to fall by 20 to 25% if people adopt natural farming, and that on the one side, input prices are rising. On the other side, MSPs are not rising, so your output prices are either stagnant or falling in real terms. And in that context, if productivity falls by 25 to 30%, mind it, across the world, the fertilizer crisis has already led to a fall of productivity. The World Food Programme has said that world agricultural production is likely to fall by about 60 million tons or something. I forget the exact number, because fertilizers are not available. And here you're having schemes to incentivize fertilizer decline, fertilizer use decline. And this is not going to be good for the farmer. That's very clear. So costs of production are going to rise. Your output prices are not rising. They're either going to be, because MSPs are not going to rise anyway, because food inflation is already looming large, and there's no way I can see MSPs rising given the political stance of the current government. So MSPs are not going to rise. MSPs will remain either unchanged, or they'll increase by 20 rupees or so per quintal and not more than that, which means that output prices are largely going to remain constant. But your productivity levels are likely to fall if this fall of fertilizer consumption actually takes place. This is a real problem. Then you have the last point that I wanted to make is about capital expenditure in agriculture. There is 7.5 lakh crore of capital expenditure happening in the economy in the current year. It's likely to rise next year as per the budget estimate. But in the 7.5 lakh crore, how much is for agriculture, animal husbandry, and fisheries capital account? You will be surprised it is only 119 crore of 7.5 lakh crore. If you add irrigation and flood control to it, you get another 350 crore. That's all. 350 crore plus 119 crore. This 119 crore is going to fall to 84 crore in the current budget. And this 350 crore is going to fall to 325 crore according to the budget. So even this paltry capital expenditure to agriculture is going to see a fall. You have agricultural infrastructure fund, which had a budget of 500 crore in the last year. Only 150 crore was spent. That 500 crore has been allocated again. How much will be spent? Nobody knows. You had Prime Minister's Matsya Sampada Yojana, which had 1,891 crore allocation last year, but only 1,400 crore was spent. Now, and this year it has been given 2,000 crore. Right? You have a large scheme for FPOs, 10,000 FPOs to be formed in this country. 955 crore was the budget last year. It's exactly the same this year also. And this year's money is not fully spent. Prime Minister's Fasal Bima Yojana, 15,500 crore was the budgeted amount in the current year. It has been cut to 13,635 crores in the next financial year. You have Animal Husbandry Infrastructure Development Fund. Its total allocation is a paltry 315 crore. You have a Fisheries and Infrastructure Development Fund. And I'm most happy to inform you that at the All India level, the allocation for that particular scheme is a great ₹25 crore. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram, for these very, very important issues that you have flagged, general issues plus sectoral issues. And now we can have a second round, but just before I invite all our panelists for the second round, let me just add one or two words regarding the budget in the overall sense, and this connects with what all the panelists were directly or indirectly hinting at. We don't need to worry about sectoral allocations, particular schemes, etc., on which, as everyone has said, that expenditures in real terms are going to go down. From the revised estimate of some 42 lakh crores, we have allocation of about 45 lakh crores. In real terms, take inflation into account, it is squeezed. So, what needs to be done is to get far more serious about two things. One, how do we raise resources? That is the biggest challenge, right? If you look at, for instance, corporate tax collection as a share of GDP during UPA2 on an average, the average figure for that entire period, it fell from 3.7%. It was 3.7% then during UPA2. In 21-22, it came down to 2.3%. It's a very significant fall as a proportion of GDP from one particular source. And why had that happened, all of you know. Because the taxes had been slashed very, very significantly. Right? Now, there is no thinking about how to ensure greater resource mobilization. So if you can touch upon this issue in our next round, those of you who wish to do that, that would be quite helpful, because that has to be the way forward. Right? Otherwise, it would continue to be, as I said, business as usual kind of story, and basically certain kinds of mythical narratives that the capital expenditure will give you growth, as Ram was mentioning. Where is the expenditure in rural areas? What is the structure of this capital expenditure? If it is going to benefit just 2 or 3 or 5 sectors in the economy which are at the top, which generate very few jobs, give you some growth, sure enough. But if all other major sectors which are important from the point of view of the well-being of citizens in this country, they don't benefit, then what do we do? Right? So on the one hand, the structure of capital expenditure And relying on that, this whole trickle-down story has been discredited so much. But if you want to latch on to it, what can be done, right? So if some of these issues, if you could also bring into your conversation, please, apart from the sectoral concerns. So we follow the same order, and let's say about 2 to 3 minutes each, if you want to give some time for our participants to raise some questions for you.
And sir,
Okay.
just wanted to, sorry, sir, just wanted to tell you that we have received a number of questions by now.
We already have.
So-
Okay,
so
thank you.
Gurpreet-
Can you just read them out?
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
Gurpreet, sir,
Quickly.
Gurpreet has sent you those questions. If you could take a look at the messages
right,
from
all right.
Gurpreet on the chat box.
Okay, so
don't
okay,
have
we
access.
have a question for Professor Kundu. How do you see the claim of green growth in budget? Yes. What does it reflect? That's one question which is directly addressed to you, sir. Then there are some questions relating to Anganwadi education. To Arman, there's a question pertaining to the issue of adequate expenditure or critical minimum expenditure, which can make public spaces more accessible. Question to Lekha, what are your thoughts on the bundling of major schemes under MWCD, which has led to unavailability of granular data on schemes like Anganwadi services? Yes. So credit guarantee for MSMEs, scheme extended. Are the provisions enough for the sector assumed to contribute 33% of our GDP? Professor Kundu, maybe you could take that up. Then state governments, they're spending on development of Dalits and Adivasis. Beena, maybe you can take up that question, please. Yes, Professor Kundu, again, is the union government making appropriate policies for inclusive and sustainable development of the cities? We don't hear much about the smart cities mission anymore. Yes, so that was specifically for you. The pandemic has created a learning deficit due to school closures, and what has been the approach of the budget in addressing the learning deficits? So any one of you can pick up that question, starting with Professor Kundu. Requesting some clarification on budget cuts for Narega. Ram, maybe you could take that. Lekha, Niti Aayog has proposed a Gender Budgeting Act. Do you think that this will help strengthen GRB as a strategy? Okay, so these were the questions on the chat box. So yes, sir, let's start with you.
Thanks. I think you have rightly pointed out that what is happening is at the macro policy level, you make certain commitments. You give certain assurance to the country. And when you look at the actual budgetary allocations, you find absolutely nowhere that concern is coming into that. You do find, take 15 ministry, you find social sector expenditure going down. Revenue expenditure is also being brought down. Subsidies component, you are struggling after giving 35,000 crore, as has been brought out by CBGA on the income tax, concessions. Now you try to struggle to, bring down the deficit by cutting down the subsidies. This is something which is disturbing, and this has been raised by, all the panelists. In the rural sector, you do disaggregate and find out how much are we actually increasing. We are not doing that. I just wanted to flag in my area of concern, where I have done some work. You made a commitment that there will be houselessness in this country by 2022, 2023, and shortage. We had estimated to be 18 million in urban areas. This was brought down to 11 million. Okay. And I can assure you that 11 million houses are going to be built with Mr. Hardeep Puri's initiative. But now, who is getting that? The whole exercise said that 90% of the shortage is for the poor and slum dwellers. Not even 12% of the dwelling units are for the slum dwellers. It's all for the affordable housing, those who can take loan from the banks, and the loan amount earlier we had also argued that the poor cannot afford to pay back a loan of more than 3 lakhs because it comes to something like 3,500 rupees per month. He cannot pay. Now, the loan amount has been increased to, the house can cost 60 lakhs. That is affordable housing for the poor when you have identified clearly that 90% of the shortage is for the slum dwellers. You have a concession up to 2 lakh. You can, take exemption in income tax. 2 lakhs means you have to have 25 lakhs as a loan. Which poor can take 25 lakhs as a poor? You target for 2,000, 3,000 rupees maximum monthly, payment. I can just tell you there are 4 verticals. One was the in situ slum upgradation. Second was you take the loan and buy the vacant houses. By the way, in urban areas, there are 10 million houses which are vacant and the market wants to sell them. And obviously, if the government gives some loan, they hope the real estate fellows will sell these houses. This, I'm sure, the way the program is being implemented, it will create additional housing unit for the middle class. They will buy another house and not address the poorest sections of the population. So the slum dwellers, where targeting was to be 90%, not even 12% of the dwelling units are going there. It's all for affordable housing, the vacant houses which are not being sold, and the government money is coming in. That is one thing. The second, quickly, I just want to mention, when you talked about giving some kind of a pension for the, sorry, you asked the question about the concern for the green strategy. In fact, they could have been easily said that Prime Minister's Awas Yojana subsidy will be given provided you follow the green technology in construction. Nothing has happened. In sanctioning of the permits and giving the subsidy, which is a massive subsidy, 1 lakh per dwelling unit, 1.5 lakh per dwelling unit, that has not been linked with green technology. Finally, the point that I really would like the panelists to consider, that you were thinking of giving some kind of a pension amount to the unorganized sector. That's a great, mission that you had. And you said, okay, you save money throughout your lifetime and we will compensate the rest. How much poor fellow can save? Not more, 55 rupees per month is the adequate amount. You cannot ask for more than that. But with that money, the fellow is saving 3 lakhs. Now a rich person can put 30 lakhs and you can put the subsidy on 30 lakhs, and the poor unorganized sector fellow gets subsidy only for 3 lakhs. Why not give the poor fellow who is saving 3 lakhs, same amount per household, same subsidy should be given as a rich person is getting? Praveen, you and me, I have already deposited 15 lakhs. I can tell you that because I'm getting a higher rate of interest. Tomorrow I'm going to put another 15 lakhs because I have that money. But the poor fellow has saved only 3 lakhs throughout his lifetime with some government subsidy. Why can't you give the same amount of subsidy per person? Don't link this subsidy with the amount of saving that you have. Obviously, rich people have more saving, and capitalism means you can get money. But this subsidized funding which is being given should not be given. It should be given equitably, and a poor unorganized sector fellow should get the same amount of subsidy per person as the rich. That's my submission, and I would plead again and again to the finance minister, they should consider this. Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you, sir. This is an extremely important point which you have flagged, and hopefully you would have the ears of the finance minister at some point. Okay, sir. Thank you. All right. So let's go to Arman, please.
Sir, I think that to my mind, it's much easier to do things around the inclusion of people with disability. I think the government of India is a huge procurer. It procures a lot of things, right? From buses to and many stuff, right? From electronics to industry, roads, everything is made. These are all outsourced, and people are. I think if these procurements are compliant to the accessibility needs of persons with disability, it solves one problem, a part of it. And one of the asks that we send every year to the finance minister, saying that the government should incentivize private players who are making their products, services, infrastructure friendly for people with disability. So it needs some investment there as well. Some serious money has to be put into implementation of the RPWD Act. there has to be the carrot and the stick method that is used. In fact, I was invited to speak at the IIT Delhi auditorium for something which is inaccessible. And I was sharing with my fellow disabled activists, the next time we should come with a bulldozer. So all places which are not compliant to the accessibility need of persons with disability, because that's what we see when people are not following rules and law. People are the government, the agencies are bulldozing. So I think these are a few things which comes to my mind. But I would again reiterate that we have if for 3 to 4 crores of young people with disability in this country, they cannot survive on pension, they cannot survive on meager amount of 500 rupees per month. What do you get of 500? So they need investment to be part of the mainstream society and not to be treated as a second-class citizen in this country. And this requires inclusion of the last person in the last village in this country, and not looked at as an afterthought, as somebody who you just distribute substandard aids and appliances and your responsibility is over. So that's what I personally think. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely powerful observation. Okay, so next we go to Beena, and in the chat box I noticed that there are 2 issues which have been flagged for. I mean, they were there, but they have been flagged again. That PSUs are being starved and disinvestments and so on, and all these governments are inviting investments through private channels or whatever, through these investor summits, etc. So what would be the long-term implications? So if anyone wishes to take that up. This whole issue of SDGs, target needs to be adequately financed, 8 years have passed, not much has happened, what will happen? So we can add that to the list of questions. All right. So let's go to Beena, please.
Yeah. So thanks. I'll just quickly respond to the state center share in budget. And I take one example of the Post-Matric Scholarship, which is a 60-40 scheme. Many times when we go to the ministry, they say that, no, the state doesn't, the state has to demand for the funds. And the state says when they demand, the center doesn't give funds. Now, if you take for example, Bihar, which is a very state that very clearly you can see that they do not release the funds for the students on time. So 2 years, 3 years backlog is there. So between the center and state fight, we fall between the cracks. The students don't get. So there are students we talk to who haven't got this scholarship for their entire 3 years. And so they take. So what happens? They go to private loan sharks, take money so that they can complete their education, and then they go into this vicious circle of poverty. So this is one thing that the center and state really need to sit. And if if it's a different government in the states to the central government, then there's a different issue altogether. Then they don't want to release the funds. So I think there is a lot of this fight between the central and state, and ultimately it is the beneficiaries or the students in this case for post-matric are being affected. So that is one big issue. We are trying to talk with the ministries to see how that can be sorted. But as of now, this will continue, I think, which is really sad. Therefore, we are also pushing the states to have some systems in place so that this doesn't happen. I would also like to respond to the PSUs, and this has been happening for some time. We know that many of the PSUs have been being sold or they're on sale. It's practically most of them. There are very few PSUs that are really left. For the Dalits and Adivasis, this is going to become a really big problem because we all know that the quota system of the reservation is pegged in public sector. So if this happens, then because private sector does not have the quota or affirmative action, this is going to be a huge problem when it comes to employment. So there has to be some thinking around with the government to see how, not so much from the budget perspective, from the perspective of the fact of employment, considering that, we are having a high level of employment. SDGs, I think there is some thinking that 2030 agenda will not be fulfilled. I think we all know that if it has to be fulfilled, the one country that has to do it right is India, because we have the highest population, we have the biggest problem. So we cannot solve SDGs without India, so if you look at health, if you look at, education, we still have a very low budget. Our demand is still minus mine, the campaign that was there, 3 and 6 for health and education together. So that demand is still there. So I don't think we're seeing really SDGs to be, there is no urgency for the SDGs from the government point of view. So how do we push and demand for some of these budgets to be increased so that we can bridge that gap? One more thing before I stop is one of the things that we've all been, I think, in some way, it has bothered us and bothers me a lot, is the practice of manual scavenging in this country. According to government data, there's still about 59,000 plus, women engaged in manual scavenging, not to mention the people who go down the sewers, and many of them, have died in the past few years. There was a pre-matric scholarship for the children of women engaged in manual scavenging, which has been totally removed now. They're saying they've clubbed it with another scheme, but not that scheme has really an increase in budget. It's about 500 crores, and that's very less. There was a rehabilitation scheme for manual scavengers that has been completely removed. There is this, we all know this government is really good at, how do you say, acronyms. They have a scheme, Namaste, for mechanization of, sanitation work. Even if that comes, I don't know how much of that will actually go to the community. Again, who owns this, who's managing this is a big question. So I think if we just look at this one scheme, and if they always say that if we have to budget, if we have to create a budget, we have to look at the last most vulnerable person, and from that perspective, if we look back, it's really bad that some of these very critical schemes are slowly being removed without actually solving the problem, in this case, scavenging. So I think we need to continue to demand that in the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beena, for your very, very useful answers and helpful answers to all the questions that you picked up. Lekha, please.
Thank you. I do agree with you when you mentioned about the sources of revenue mobilization, which we need to focus into. I can't agree with you more. But the fiscal space, as you mentioned, it was articulated only from that threshold ratios perspective. But how to improve the fiscal space is not given adequate attention. And 2 ways we can improve the fiscal space. One, of course, by looking into the financing pattern of deficit. Right now, we are doing the market borrowings, but there is a big no to the kind of monetization of deficit which we have controlled over the years. Though there is a school of thought regarding the MMT and all, it is not bought in India. That it's inflationary. That's the way it was put forward, and we cannot even touch that monetization of deficit to increase the fiscal space. Now, given that limitations in the financing pattern of deficit, of course, external borrowing, we can't do that. It is insignificant. It's 1% of GDP. But in this tug of war between the monetization of deficit and the external financing, I don't know what it will be. Like you resort to external debt more comfortably than doing the monetization of deficit. So these are the questions in my mind too. But regarding the tax mobilization, of course, there are issues related to mobilizing the revenues through wealth tax. Then capital gains we can't touch because the policy certainty is very important for the financial exuberance. So these are the ways in which those kind of taxes were not touched. Now coming to the question related to the corporate tax you raised. Given that global international taxation in the global, the pillar 1 and pillar 2, in order to avoid the tax war, we are going towards a global minimum tax of 15% for the corporate tax. So it was like 25 in India. Over the years, it was reduced to now it is going to touch the 15%. Now, the question is related to the incidence of the tax. If you look into the tax incidence of corporate tax incidence, we need to be clear whether the incidence is going to be on labor or capital. And if it is on capital, whether a homogeneous cut in the corporate tax is relevant, or the people who belong to below threshold of some 250 crores or something, effectively their, effective corporate tax rate is more than what is paid by the industrial giants. So whether we need to do a homogeneous tax cut in the corporate sector, or whether we need to look into the effective tax, where it is high and who is suffering, when you announce a major taxation. Now, what we announced regarding the tax, a populist policy, because it's an election budget, that is, only going to impact on a very minuscule percentage of the Indian population, what we have announced on the taxation front. So we cannot cheer up, the entire budget, we looked into from that perspective, that it is very pro-poor because we reduce the taxes, but it is not pro-poor if you're looking only into that tax policy announcement, which is only, how many are working in the organized sector and how many are within the tax net. So
Yes.
These are the questions we need to ask, and we may get an answer that it is even beyond 4% or 3%. Now, coming specifically to the gender budgeting question, of course, the legal mandate for the gender budgeting is welcome, but how you do that quotes, that is very important, because many countries have attempted the legal mandate for the gender budgeting. In Korea, that was incorporated within the national finance law, but in Philippines, it came as an earmarking. But earmarking, as you know, it can be a second best principle of any not only gender budgeting, any PFM, so we cannot do an earmarking just like the way Philippines has done it by making it gender and development, that mandate. It has to be result oriented, and the results and resources needs to be linked. So how you code that, what are the details of the legal mandate needs to be looked into. But I'm for a gender budgeting act to be in the country, because making it mandatory will improve this promising framework a lot. Right now, it's only within the budget circular. It is in the budget circular, it is made mandatory. But more than that, if it is coming as a finance law, finance act, then that's more than welcome. Then the question related to bundling or the convergence, of course, public expenditure convergence is welcome. But the way it is done, as she rightly pointed out, many of the schemes we are unable to track over the years what has happened, because in the process of convergence, this lack of transparency in the budget, in the gender budget, when you open, as you rightly mentioned, we are unable to track the expenditure. So that's a matter of major concern. And even the petroleum, when I look into the last mile connectivity of providing gender budgeting in infrastructure, energy infrastructure, providing clean fuel to the women in the low income household, but in the Department of Petroleum or even in the gender budget, where is that allocation? So, we don't know about that, but we are still talking about, providing energy infrastructure, gender budgeting, but there is no allocation for that. It's over. It's done and dusted. So this kind of lack of transparency and rhetoric that is happening about the gender budgeting is sad. But I do, as a public finance economist, I do agree to the convergence. Convergence is important, but as you mentioned, it's bundling up in such a manner that making it non-transparent. Of course, it is difficult to track the expenditure. And I think these are the questions raised to me. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Lekha, very much. Very apt answers again. Ram, there's a question which you should certainly pick up. This is someone from Nepal who's worried about declining food production in India, and how does that impact on food security also in Nepal, given Nepal's dependence on our own food production, etc. So does the budget indicate that there will be horrible food crisis situation in South Asia? I'm just reading part of what has been said. Horrible food crisis situation in South Asia, increasing vulnerability of the marginalized. So if you want to talk about that, and also this whole support for our neighbors, etc. Do you have any thoughts on that? And for Professor Kundu, if there was this whole question about smart cities and what has happened to those, and are our cities inclusive at all? Yeah, so if we can take these, and along with that, one last question, I think this has been repeated again, credit guarantee for MSMEs. Scheme has been extended. Are the provisions enough for the sector to assume responsibility of contributing up to 33% of our GDP? And yeah, I mean, of course, it's too precise a number in terms of what the credit guarantees will do, but something regarding the health of the MSMEs. Any of you? Yes. So we first go to Ram, and then please feel free to respond to these other issues.
I'll try to answer some of the important questions that came up. Second is revenue mobilization. I largely agree with Professor Lekha, but with a little, I would like to approach that from a slightly different angle, in the sense that when corporate tax rates were cut in 2018 or so to 25%, in my view, that was actually a response to a trend of declining corporate profits from 2011-12 onwards. There's a declining trend of growth rate of corporate profits happening. Corporate India was badly hit by demonetization and also by the GST reform. And this corporate tax cut that we saw in 2018 was actually an incentive, kind of a subsidy for the corporate sector at that time. But then it led to a loss of about 1.6 lakh crore per year in terms of at least in the first 2 or 3 years, if I remember the numbers right. I haven't looked at it more recently. But if you look at the COVID years of 2020 and 2021, you see a soaring of corporate profits. This huge, when 84% of India has lost incomes in terms of households, you see a soaring of profits of the corporate sector during the pandemic. And this has been left completely untaxed. That's the real problem that we have. The corporates have benefited immensely from running down their debt during the pandemic, by low wages during the pandemic. They have been able to hire and fire workers during the pandemic more easily than before. All this has led to a very, very favorable condition for huge, big corporates. And I don't think a condition exists anymore to keep the corporate taxes as low as they were during a declining trend of corporate profit. So I think that needs a relook very clearly. And the global tax that you mentioned, Professor Lekha, I think that was indeed the fear that many had, that if you fix it at 15% to push Ireland or Iceland from 12% to 15% to make Microsoft or Apple pay more taxes in Ireland, what will actually happen is countries like India will go from 30 to 15 as well, saying that's the minimum. So actually, there'll be a race to the bottom with respect to corporate taxes if you fix it at 15 like that. Only to make a few companies pay more taxes offshore. So that concern remains, and I think your statement echoes that concern in a sense to me, because it should not come down to 15. That'd be very bad if we are looking at that sort of a trajectory. With respect to the question from Nepal, I would like to put it this way. Now, there's a lot of discussion in India as to whether the food production in India, food grain production in India is excess or not. Does India have a surplus or not? There's a huge debate ongoing. I would tend to think that there isn't a surplus in India, which is very clear. During last year, when there was a heat wave that hit North India, Rabi wheat was badly hit, and we had a fall of production from about 109 million tons to about 106 million tons in terms of wheat production. And that led to enormous concern with respect to food availability, inflation, etc. Wheat exports were banned. And at a time when the world was stocking food grains during COVID, this added to the global food inflation as well. Now, this year, there is wheat production has come back in India. Rabi wheat is likely to be, including Rabi wheat, we are going to have something like 112 million tons of wheat in 22-23. Now, the question of whether this will be available for others, if India exports this wheat, will depend upon what is the prospect of food inflation in India over the next few months. If food inflation remains high in India, India is likely to pick up more buffer stock, or it is likely to keep more buffer stock for open market release as it did last year. Last year, it released 30 lakh tons into the open market to reduce inflation. If India wants to keep some space for that kind of open market operations to control food inflation in the coming months of 2023, then less wheat is likely to be available for exports, including to neighboring countries like Nepal. No, that's the only broad statement you can make. Rest will all depend on the geopolitical and other political economy considerations of a time. I cannot say more. Last point about MGNREGS. MGNREGS, the cut is ominous, of course, because government will keep saying that this is a demand-led scheme and whoever comes for work will be given employment, and it doesn't matter what amount is allocated to it, whoever comes will get work. But that's complete, it doesn't make sense at all. If you think that 80,000 crore will have to be spent on it, why don't you budget for 80,000 crore? Because if you budget only 60,000 crore, when you know that 90,000 crore will be required, what it calls into question is the complete integrity of budget numbers. Now, you have cut food inflation. You probably know that food subsidies may have to rise next year. You've cut fertilizer subsidies. You know that fertilizer subsidies in the revised estimate are likely to be higher the next year. Petroleum subsidies, you know that they're likely to be higher next year. Similarly for this, if you know all this, then why don't you budget for an accurate number, for a more realistic number? Why do you create an artificial fiscal space for the budget purpose, for the budget announcement purpose? And when the revised estimates rise, you will have to cut somewhere. And that cuts will fall into some soft sector in the social sector. No, that kind of lack of integrity of budget numbers is, I think, more striking this year. It used to be in the past in terms of hiding fiscal deficit with an FCI loan and so on. That has now gone. But now this is the new form of sort of fudging budget numbers, in my view, by keeping your budget estimates deliberately low to create fiscal space for new announcements, and cutting somewhere as the year goes by. You will have to raise these, and you will create some space elsewhere to incur these expenditures. These numbers then will have no meaning.
Thanks, Ram. Thanks. I mean, that is exactly what I meant when I said that. So if we have from our panelists,
Praveen,
yes, Professor Kundu, please.
just 2 quick points. First, for Arman, sometime in 2008 or 9, there was a recognition in the Ministry of Statistics that we don't have the data for physically and mentally challenged persons. So the first survey was conducted, but at that time there was apprehension that families would not like to report any challenged person mentally or physically, especially with regard to the girl child, and they said that mother-in-law will report this daughter-in-law to be mentally challenged. All kinds of non-serious issues were debated, and we had conducted this survey, and we did find that families were coming forward. We are not asking for an evidence of being challenged, but on the basis of self-reporting, the figure was something like 1.6, 1.7%. Now the figure would be slightly higher. But as Arman, you mentioned, globally it is 15%. And the US figure I saw, it's something like 20% plus with much better nutrition level. How come they have a higher level of challenge? Because there are incentives. In here, you don't get anything. If you report that your 3 children have problems, they don't get any benefit. So there is no incentive. So I would entirely agree that the reporting system would improve, provided there are specific schemes. And for that, we need to make budgetary allocation. That's one thing. Quickly, if I can respond to what Beena was talking about, I just want to mention, for the first time again, India discrimination report has come out. Praveen, you wanted me to perhaps talk about it. India discrimination report talks about discrimination in India against gender, about scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, vis-a-vis non-scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and religious minority, discrimination against Muslim population. And we have, in this study, we have used official data, no primary survey, national sample survey data, PLFS data, periodic labor force survey, all relating to labor market. We have not analyzed discrimination in the religious spheres. We have just found out how the labor market in access to employment and wages are discriminating. And we have shown that the discrimination against scheduled caste, scheduled tribe population have gone down slightly in the rural areas from about 60% to 45%. In the rural areas, there is not much of a discrimination against the Muslim. But in the urban labor market and urban housing market, you find significant discrimination against the religious minorities. As far as gender is concerned, the discrimination is 100%. In fact, the discrimination comes up not only employer denying, but even the family not allowing. The girl herself saying, I'm not interested. These are all social pressures which work on that. I just want half a minute again. Is he talking about the smart city mission? I think it has been put in the back burner because it is realized that smart cities are exclusionary. Wherever smart city mission has started, migration rate has gone down because the elite capture takes place. There are area specific things and the elites don't vote. So they are not a part of vote bank. So basically, if you look at the period of the pandemic, many of the state governments, 18 of the state governments have passed a rule that job should be reserved for the local person because employment was a major issue. Haryana has done that. Uttar Pradesh has done that. Karnataka has done that. Either they are considering passing legislation or ordinances. So cities are becoming exclusionary. Thankfully, the market is not. Market is still going by the efficiency and cheaper labor. So that's why all these talks of the government is wishy-washy. I'm happy that Smart City Mission has been put in the back burner. Cities should be inclusionary. There has to be a lot more migration from north to south because of the population growth rates are so very different. The Indian labor market has to be integrated. Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. This was very, very useful. Subrat, I imagine we have exhausted our time. So if that is the case, then let me hand over to Subrat and let me, on my behalf and on behalf of all our participants in this conversation, thank you very much for this illuminating, very, very illuminating conversation, bringing so many issues on the table in a manner which hopefully would be a lot of food for thought for all our participants. Thank you very much, each one of you. Thank you. Subrat.
Yes. So many thanks to all our friends who joined us in today's discussion. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, we thought a lot about the choice between doing it offline or online, but we could have friends joining even from Kathmandu. So I think it was a good decision to do it online. And so many thanks to all our friends who joined us today in this discussion. And really heartfelt thanks to all our eminent panelists for bringing out, I would say, really in-depth insights on a range of issues. I mean, as far as CBGA's overall positioning is concerned, I mean, we have a perspective, we do take positions on a range of issues, but we also consciously want to contribute towards deepening public understanding of some of these complexities, some of these issues. And I think today's discussion has done that really well. All our panelists have kind of, articulated the deeper issues so well. I think we have got a very high value for the time that all of us have taken out, and we will be curating the video, putting it online. So this has been a great discussion. So sincere thanks to Professor Amitabh Kundu, Arman, Beena, Professor Lekha, and Professor Ram. Heartfelt thanks to all of you, and special thanks to Professor Jha for moderating this discussion really well and sticking to the time as well. So we have overshot the time limit by almost 20 minutes. And I think, Arman, did you want to add something, please?
After you're done, Subrat.
So, okay, sure. So I think, once Arman adds his final words, then we'll finally close the event. But many thanks to all of you. Sorry, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that the CBGA analysis, walking the tightrope analysis of the budget 2023-24 has been uploaded on our website. I would request my colleagues to please share the link here. Okay, so it's uploaded on the CBGA website, and you can please. So the presentation at the beginning could capture only a snapshot of the insights and data that we have presented in the report. I'm sure you'll find it useful, but the range of perspectives and insights we have had from our panelists is far greater. So, and I think it's been a great learning experience for me and all of us. So once again, many thanks to all of you. Over to you, Arman.
Before Arman comes in, just one sentence, Subrat. Joseph Aloy Schumpeter, one of the greatest economists of all times, used to say, how much a country can be considered civilized depends on how it mobilizes resources. So that is something I wanted to leave with all of you as a thought. Thank you. Arman.
Sir, I just wanted to share and reiterate my point that how disability needs investment. Most of you may have been aware that our former Prime Minister, Sri Manmohan Singh, has been shifted to the last row in the Rajya Sabha because he is using a wheelchair now, and for ease of mobility. I think it's heartbreaking and it comes as a shocking news for people like me who are a wheelchair user, where we should talk about political participation of people with disability. A former Prime Minister has been moved to the last row. And that's how, again, I reiterate that disability needs investment, and it's for all of us, and it does not discriminate against anybody. Thank you so much, Subrat, once again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Arman, for highlighting that point. And so this brings us to the end of this really interesting evening. So many thanks to all of you. Thank you so much. And we hope to stay in touch with all of you. Thank you.